Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to dive into intellectual history and political theory with a detailed look at the three major ideologies of modernity that impacted the entire globe. And we're going to begin this discussion with the framework of the slogan of the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution is often regarded as the sort of inaugurating event of modernity, the moment, at least in the West, where something decisively new broke through the ancient regime. Not just in France, even though that's specifically where that phrase ancient regime comes from, but ultimately percolating very quickly all over the West. And we can also see all three major ideologies of modernity at work in the revolution. And in fact, the slogan of the revolution, and to this day the motto for both France and Haiti, spells this out very clearly. The call for liberty, equality, and fraternity, or in French, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And these three slogans can be understood to correspond, roughly speaking, to liberalism, socialism, and nationalism. So working through this slogan is kind of a framing network. And by looking at examples of this slogan in action, so to speak, in the French Revolution and elsewhere, we're going to explore these three bodies of political thought that shaped the modern world. Real quick note here with the image you see on your screen. It says liberty, equality, fraternity in French, or death. This is an image pulled from the revolutionary period. Now, the French no longer have or death at the end of the slogan as their national slogan. It was deemed a little radical and maybe a little morbid as well. But originally, this is what the full slogan was. Now we're going to discuss these three ideologies in a different order than the slogan presents them. So we're going to begin with fraternity or nationalism. Now fraternity corresponds roughly to the idea of brotherhood or sisterhood, the term fraternity. Not so much in a literal sense, but in a shared identity and a shared friendship. And the creation of a shared identity really rests at the heart of the idea of nationalism. Now, of all the three ideologies we are going to discuss, I think that nationalism is the hardest for us to distance ourselves from. The organization of populations and nations that define everyone in a particular geographic boundary as citizens or subjects of that particular state seems so natural and self-evident to us that it is sometimes hard to wrap our head around how it ever used to be otherwise. As Benedict Anderson, a historian who we'll be discussing in a moment, put it, nationalism enjoys immense emotional legitimacy. First, there is just the dizzying array of different principalities before nationalism was how we organized populations that makes putting ourselves back into this mindset fairly difficult. Anyone who watches the show The Last Kingdom about Viking Age England will probably know this, because England back in the 10th century wasn't England at all, but it was a combination of at least 4 different kingdoms and probably twice as many ethnicities. And this typifies, right, the world in general at the time, yes, Europe, but elsewhere as well, where there's just so many different kingdoms, principalities, and it creates a lot of confusion in the modern mind. Another example, aside from a TV show, is this clip, this snippet that you see here of a map of Germany in the mid 17th century, right? Look how many divisions, how many different principalities. To us, it just looks like chaos. It looks like quite a mess because these weren't consolidated into these usually larger, right, and very distinct nation states that we're all comfortable with today. Moreover, nationalism is just all over the place. It has spread out all over the globe, and it can be combined with both left-wing and right-wing ideologies. Now, obviously, far-right regimes, such as the Nazi regime in Germany, are usually aggressively nationalistic, but so are what remains of most communist regimes. And of course, regimes of parliamentary democracy, as exist in the United States and European states, can also be hyper-nationalistic, with the United States probably leading the way in this regard for the West. So it is seemingly irresistible to political regimes of all persuasions to adopt a nationalist perspective. As Benedict Anderson commented, indeed, nationness is the one most universally legitimate value in the political life of our time. End quote. So before nationalism, how did people form their identities? What were they? What did they see themselves as? Well, it depended a bit on where you were and who you were. If you were a common farmer in a village, and roughly speaking, this goes for Africa and Europe as well, and the East, you might have identified with a clan or basically an extended family. Think perhaps of how Okinawa structures his identity in your reading, Things Fall Apart. This is a good illustration of how a lot of people in the world organize their identity. On the other hand, if you were a knight in service of a lord, then your loyalty was to the house or family of that lord. Oftentimes, people had local identities and only a vague sense of attachment to a distant ruler, such as the Holy Roman Emperor, who ruled over all these far-flung little kingdoms and principalities. Certainly, they didn't consider people hundreds of miles away from them as some kind of kindred member of the same community, even if they spoke the same language. Now, once the modern era really gets underway, this changes. Historian Benedict Anderson famously explained nationalism as an ideology that creates what he called an imagined community. Your textbook mentions this in passing, but we're really going to break down what that means. When you think of a community, or your community, perhaps, what many of you might first think of, the most obvious thing that might come to mind, are the people in your town, your school, maybe your friend networks. In short, people who are near you in vicinity. Quick aside, the internet of course changes this up dramatically, but that is another topic for another time. But what nationalism does is extend the sphere of who is supposed to be in our communities as brothers, sisters, not literally, right, but fellow comrades. It extends this to an unusually large geographic space, a space that often includes people of very different cultural and class backgrounds than ourselves, right? So it not only expands it geographically, but it expands it over a large amount of diversity. And if you think about it, this is a really hard sell. What do I have to do with these people I don't know hundreds of miles away? What do they have to do with me? You are never going to meet the vast majority of them, let alone develop close relationships. For example, people often say they love America, by which they mean the United States. But what exactly does that mean? Do they love all the people in it? Probably not. Highly unlikely. Do they love its founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution? If so, is America, or the United States, really reducible to an ambiguous set of 200-year-old declarations and parchments written by an incredibly small portion of the population, even for back then? I don't think so. Do they mean the physical land, perhaps? The geographic space of the United States of America? Maybe if they are a hardcore environmentalist who has hiked extensively all over the country, that's what they mean. But otherwise, again, probably not. So what nationalism does is it gets people to not ask all these questions. Instead, it sets up an abstract notion of the people or the citizens of a particular geographic space. A geographic space that has borders that are, more often than not, drawn arbitrarily and or through a process of warfare. And nationalism instills in the population within those borders an instinctive and unquestioned sense of belonging to that imagined community. And, according to Anderson, this is only possible around the rise of the Industrial Revolution because of a few key factors, two of which we are going to mention. First, the end of royal family rule. Before nationalism, as you might be discovering in your textbook, right, trying to keep track of all of these different rulers, elite noble families actually held powerful positions in multiple nations. So the system was a hierarchical dynasty spread out all over Europe. For example, your textbook mentions the Habsburgs dynasty as a good example of this. The decline of this system and the rise, in turn, of anti-monarchical ideologies, anti-aristocratic ideologies, such as republicanism and liberalism, meant that something had to replace the role usually played by the sometimes semi-divine role of the king or the queen in uniting people. Here again, France is an excellent example. Louis XIV, who believed he was sent by God to rule France and was known as the Sun King, the idea was he was shining his light all over France, he is famous for claiming, "I am the state." Quick aside here again, since I like giving TV recommendations that tie into historical subjects, Louis XIV and his construction of Versailles, also the subject of a strange, if entertaining show called Versailles, which I can't exactly recommend because it's very odd and has a lot of problems, but it is very entertaining and will give you some sense of the sense of entitlement and privilege that the aristocracy and then the monarchy had in France during this period. Okay, so contrast this claim by Louis XIV that he is the state, right? He embodies France, and there's no difference between him, his desires, his judgments, right, and the needs of France and the judgment of God. It's really what he's claiming there. Contrast this to the third article of the Declaration of Rights and Man and Citizen, which was the document drawn up by the French revolutionaries in the first stage of the revolution. This article declares that, quote, "The principle of any sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body, no individual can exert authority which does not emanate expressly from it." So the image, the idea of a divine king as the embodiment of a people has been replaced by the image of the people themselves as the object worthy of veneration and sovereignty. This certainly does not mean that hierarchy disappears, But, as Benedict Anderson explains, in the official version or ideal version of all nationalisms is the idea that, quote, the nation is always conceived as a deep, horizontal comradeship, end quote. I'm going to take a moment here to look at these illustrations as another example of this dynamic. On your left, you have an image of Louis XVI, an image honoring Louis XVI. So that's different than the Sun King. He was the 14th. 2 generations later, you get his much more inept, bumbling grandson, Louis XVI. And traditional symbols here dominate this illustration of Louis XVI coronation, his rise to king in 1775. He takes his crown from a saint who is holding the cross. The cross is a little cut off here in the image, but the woman there, right, that's standing is holding a cross. This indicates the divine origins of his powers. There are angels behind him carrying banners and emblems associated with the French monarchy that go all the way back to the Middle Ages. You would not guess from this engraving that less than 20 years later, the same king would lose his head, right? In the throes of a revolution. This is traditional veneration of the symbols of the authority and legitimacy of the monarchy. Now contrast that with the image on the right, which is a celebration of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, that big gigantic document, right, that the woman is running up to with her arms outstretched. That's the Declaration of Rights in Man and Citizen. So it was a very important document for its symbolic power as well as for its specific contents, because it's really replacing, right, the role, the place of the role that in the imagination that was previously played by the monarchy. Here you see that the rights of man and citizen is separating, right? It's sort of this wall between the sunlit world of liberty, again, instead of a king, right? Being the Sun King, it's a document of liberty and popular sovereignty bringing it. So it's the sunlit world of liberty on one hand, and then the other, behind a declaration, you have the dark realm of feudal rights and privileges. And it's hard to see in the image, but there's a crawling figure in the lower left corner of the picture that is representative, right, of the darkness before the revolution. So, the delegitimization, right, the end of aristocratic and monarchical systems of power that spanned across different ethnicities, different groups, different languages, that needs to be replaced. And it is replaced by this imagining of the people of a nation and a celebration, right, of that people. Now, the second historical development that makes nationalism and its power possible is the press. The spread of the printing press made the dissemination, right, of this new ideology possible in a way that it never was before. Consider how powerful such images as the one we just looked at of the Declaration, right, could be once they were easily spread throughout France. And as literacy increased during the same period, more and more people had access to the texts, which explained and created the idea of a unified people under a single nation. In earlier centuries, when books were only the property of elites and clergy, and you only heard about the king or the unifying, right, aristocratic family through that clergy, such a mass media that could send a specific message out to people hundreds of miles away from you, that was impossible. We see an image here, also from the French Revolution, of a group of journalists. These are all, I'm not going to go into the details, but they represent different commentators, what we might refer to today as pundits, political, commentators from the French Revolution, and it's celebrating their role as messengers of the people, right? Spreading the will, the thoughts, the anger, the hopes, the love of the people throughout France and elsewhere, right? Eventually throughout the world. So this is a very important development, and it simply wasn't possible even a few hundred years before. Now, one more quality about nationalism that is worth mentioning is that while it is overtly advocated for as a vision of a united people, most nationalisms also claim that this oneness has ancient roots. In other words, they are simply bringing back to a present, a mystical unity of the people that has been lost somehow. The narratives of how it got lost vary. For example, the Irish nationalist and socialist James Connolly, who we will be learning more about in weeks to come, appealed to the conditions of equality that existed in what he called ancient Erin. Erin is an old name for Ireland. Now, these narratives of ancient oneness and unity almost never hold up under historical scrutiny. For example, with Connolly's invocation here of ancient Erin, it leaves out that before one ambitious Irish lord actually invited the English into Ireland around the 13th century. That's how they got there, and they just ever afterwards refused to leave. Most Irish people were busy fighting and killing one another. It was an Irish lord that wanted help against his opponent, and so he actually invited an aristocratic English family in to help him defeat his opponent in Ireland. And probably these Irish people would have found such a claim to community with everyone in Ireland on the basis of a common language and the fact they all happened to be on this island to be rather puzzling. Nonetheless, it's very unusual to not have this quality. Now, in some nations that are very new and are products of the colonial process, you just can't get away with this. For example, the United States is probably the classic example of a nation that can't really make up a convincing story about ancient oneness, right? Because we have very good historical records, right, of how the nation developed, and it was not that long ago. But for any place where people have been populating it for a long time and been sharing a language, for 1,000 years or more, this mystical oneness is usually a part of their imagined community. All right. Next up is liberty. We've got fraternity. Now we're going to liberty, which corresponds, right, roughly speaking, to liberalism. Now, the association between liberalism and liberty is immediately apparent. The very term liberalism is referencing its devotion to liberty, or freedom. We've also talked about the emergence of liberalism already in this course. As we saw when looking at John Locke, liberalism is an ideology of personal freedom and the belief that the purpose of government is and ought to be restricted to ensuring that freedom. From this tradition, we get many cherished principles of contemporary government, such as freedom of speech and freedom of worship, just to name two. However, the liberty of liberalism is a liberty that refers specifically to the individual. And liberalism as a political theory either A, does not admit that there may be a conflict between affording individuals as much liberty as possible and creating freedom for larger groups, Or B, if it does admit to such a conflict, it overtly values individual liberty over collective or group liberty. Moreover, classical liberalism, it is important to note here that we are not talking about contemporary politics of the Democratic Party in the United States, right? We're talking about classical liberalism. Makes it difficult. Classical liberalism makes it difficult to justify the government intervening in a harmful social practice if it has to impinge on individual liberty to do so. For example, during the civil rights movement in the United States, and sometimes to this day, opponents of civil rights legislation, we're in the 1950s, 60s here, right, would often argue that such laws violated their personal liberty. Civil rights legislation violated white people's personal liberty. So the way they put this is as follows. Say, for example, I owned a restaurant, and the government passes a law that says I have to serve black people as well as white people. I own this restaurant, most likely somewhere in the segregated South. Well, I could, and people in fact did, quite a lot, respond that this infringes on my personal liberty, since I own, right, that restaurant, and as we know, liberalism developed as a political ideology that defended personal private property, almost and usually before all else. So if the store or the restaurant is my property, how can the government tell me who to serve or who to not serve? I can do what I want with my own property. That is a clear restriction of my liberty, right, to do what I please with my own property. So classical liberalism, which in America is more or less, not exactly, but most closely resembles libertarianism. Classical liberalism struggles with any situation where someone exercising their personal rights conflicts with other questions of social justice that are not so easily resolved by liberalism's insistence that individual liberty always produces good things, and restricting it, except for in cases of property theft or physical violence, always produces harm or bad things. Remember the famous saying, sometimes attributed to Thomas Jefferson and sometimes to David Thoreau, the best government is that which governs least. Now, to come back to Europe and France, we can again look to the French Revolution for another historical example of liberalism coming of age. Just a moment ago, we looked at the third or the fourth, I can't remember, one of the articles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. We're going to look at another one, the second one, which reads, quote, "The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression." End quote. Article 4, okay, so the one earlier was Article 3, not why I was confused. Article 4 then goes on to clarify what it means by liberty. Quote, "Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law." End quote. So this emphasis on liberty reflects many things, not the least a revolt from a very repressive ancient regime that forbid people to practice their own religion or basically live their lives as they wished if it clashed with traditional standards. However, it also reflects the social background of most of the revolutionaries writing up this document, mainly middle-class men who had benefited from the rise of capitalism somewhat, but were held back from assuming the higher status that their peers in, say, England enjoyed, because of ancient regime hierarchies in France that valued an aristocratic heritage and taxed everyone else much more than the aristocracy. So the liberty that liberalism valued was not only embraced for abstract reasons of principle, right? But also because this was a form of liberty that was going to empower a class of people that were trying to embrace the basic social practices of philosophies of early emergent capitalism. Not surprisingly, then, one of the most important groups of liberties, according to the political thinkers who built liberalism, are property rights. So the people who created liberalism had a deep economic incentive built into the very foundation of the ideology. Now, because of the focus on individual liberty, liberalism gave birth to the moral and cultural philosophy of individualism, an idea that is hard to narrowly define, but basically elevates the beauty, glory, and special qualities of individuals as opposed to communities as the highest value. Western societies, especially the United States, are so deeply individualistic that one can easily confront this fairly directly a dozen times a day, if not more. If you doubt this, all you have to do is turn on TV. Almost every other commercial is more or less saying to you, be amazing, be different, be Steve Jobs, stand out amongst the crowd, being normal is boring and awful, realize your highest potential, go against the grain, etc., etc., etc. Try this exercise, right? Just watch one commercial break and see how many sort of shout-outs to individualism you can identify. The message here is that the ultimate beauty is found in the individuality and in doing your thing, as the most recent Coca-Cola campaign, that's like literally their slogan, right? Do your thing. And the correlation to this, the flip side of this, is that anything that might infringe on this and infringe on you doing your thing is inherently oppressive, no matter what it is. All right. Finally, of the three ideologies being discussed today, liberalism is the least self-conscious of being an ideology. It's not the least formally articulated. That would actually be nationalism. But liberalism often presents itself as a self-evident, right? To steal an important phrase from the foundation of liberalism, self-evident set of beliefs about justice and the way the world does and should work. Now, this was not nearly as true when it was first being founded, but even then, classical liberals, in which we would include not only most French revolutionaries, but also most of the so-called founding fathers of the United States, they believed that they had stumbled on the scientific and therefore objective rules for a balanced and self-sufficient and just society, just as Isaac Newton had recently discovered how the laws of gravity held all the universe in place. They had discovered, right, the perfect, natural, just system for arranging a society. So they were a little bit more conscious, both that they were articulating something, but also that they were claiming that this is totally natural. But by today, so many of the tenets of classical liberalism are assumed to not be judgment calls or a reflection of a society's values or priorities, but simply an objective understanding guided by reason alone. This is so deeply ingrained in most of us that to call someone or something, quote, ideological, is usually an insult, an accusation of fanaticism or blindness. And that is because of the power and pull of liberalism writ large in the modern world, and simultaneously our unawareness that liberalism is itself necessarily an ideology. If you've ever been called ideological as a bad thing, you know what I'm talking about. Nevertheless, although liberalism is widespread and extremely powerful, there is more resistance to it in our modern world than there is to nationalism. Many groups with very different political goals resist many aspects of liberalism, from conservative religious groups who do not value individuality nearly as much or at all, to radical leftists who believe in the importance of collective freedom as much as individual freedom, or more to the point, as I'll discuss in a moment, view them as linked. And in fact, some social democratic states in Europe, places like Sweden or the Netherlands, have pretty much made up their mind to reject some aspects of classical liberalism in an attempt to create a society where there is more social security, if less individual freedom in the way that is usually understood in more capitalistic countries. All right, so that brings us to the final term of the slogan, equality, which can be connected to the third major ideology of modernity, socialism. It is important to note that egalitarian forms of society long predate capitalism. In fact, almost all early societies, back when we were all hunter-gatherers, were organized along egalitarian lines. A side note here, if you are interested in a surviving example of this type of organization, I would recommend looking into the Bushmen, also known as the Sand People of Southern Africa, who by and large still live by this very ancient egalitarian form of social organization. But there have also been many religious groups that live communally and very sparsely, and more contemporary versions of this have included a critique of the materialism of capitalism. There are also other modern political philosophies that are opposed to capitalism. Socialism is not the only one, such as anarchism, that has its own history of influential thinkers and activists. But socialism in the modern sense, especially socialisms informed by the political scientist and historian Karl Marx, has been by far the most powerful ideology that arose to oppose the inequality and disruption caused by capitalism. So I'm going to take some time to explain just a few aspects of Marxism. Please note that this is hardly exhaustive. First, a common misconception is that Marx would have opposed the development of industrialism or capitalism in the first place. On the contrary, Marx was not a traditionalist, wanting to return to some point in the past, or especially not to feudalism. Rather, he believed that capitalism, by solving the problem of scarcity, made socialism possible. It was a question, however, of who owned the technology of industrialism and how the goods that that technology produced were distributed. This is why a somewhat vague phrase, the means of production, is so important to Marxism. What Marx means by this is basically the factories and farms where products and food are created and processed. That's what the means of production means. And he points out that under capitalism, the people who own the factories and own the farms are almost never the people who actually farm or create products, right, who work. It is capitalists whose sole purpose is to make money off the industry they own that own the means of production, right? What does everyone else do? Well, deprived of owning any means of production themselves, everyone else is forced to sell their labor in order to survive, because it's all they've got, right? They can't survive otherwise because they're deprived of the means of production. And because paying these workers less than what their labor is worth is essential to the capitalists making a profit, these workers are usually not paid well, which is necessary anyway, even if it wasn't a question of profit, because you don't want to pay your workers so much that they could perhaps be self-sufficient and not have to work anymore, or, much more likely, be able to themselves purchase some means of production and therefore survive independently. Because then, again, why would they work for you, right? The turning to wage labor, in other words, is an act of desperation, according to Marx. And capitalists need cheap and dependent labor in order to benefit, right, from their ownership of the means of production. A really clear example of this, we're going to leave France and head over to England for a moment, is the process of enclosure in England that took place there. Now, once capitalist agriculture, we're talking mostly in the 17th century, once capitalist agriculture and livestock raising, ranching basically, pushed the peasants off of the land, they poured into cities destitute and desperate. Because the process of capitalist agriculture and livestock raising needed way more land, and they didn't have use for all the peasants who previously were on that land. So they just get pushed off, and they pour into the countryside and then into the cities. Some of these people ended up being factory workers. Some ended up in semi-penal institutions known as workhouses, where they were required to work, and in usually awful conditions, for food and a roof over their heads. If you did take a peek, by the way, at the document a few weeks ago where Locke is discussing what is to be done with the poor, that's a more detailed look at these workhouses. And some ended up as bandits and criminals. Famous highwaymen actually comes from that phrase, comes from this period, because there were people who would basically rob aristocratic coaches in the countryside. But the sudden development of so many destitute people resulted from their loss of access to their means of production, the land. So although there are many different versions of socialism derived from Marxism, some, for example, emphasize state ownership of the means of production, while others emphasize workers owning the means of production. All of them highlight the injustice of what they often call wage slavery, and they seek to distribute property equally. And corresponding to this redistribution of property is, so to speak, a redistribution of values. Generally speaking, socialists value individual freedom, like liberals or like liberalism, but also believe that there is a connection between that individual freedom and the freedom and well-being of larger communities. Perhaps this cannot be summed up any better than the expression that no man or woman is an island. And they believe that true creative and spiritual freedom, which is difficult to enjoy without material well-being, right? It's really hard to be an artist if you're starving to death. They think that valuable freedom can only be had for one if it is had for all. Socialism also recognizes that while individuals vary, people who are born into the same time, place, and class have their personalities and characters profoundly shaped by that culture. So, even the most apparently self-made man that the individualism of liberalism seems to celebrate above all else, socialists would point out, even that man or woman owes his achievements and resources to the generations that have come before him. All right. Now, historical example of our three ideologies: equality, or something grasping towards socialism, because the full articulation of Marxism has to wait until the mid-19th century, so about half a century before the French Revolution, or after the French Revolution, excuse me. But of these three portions of the French Revolutionary slogan, equality had to struggle the most to make itself felt. But it was there. It was also there. Although the revolution started out as mostly liberal or highly individualistic, in its more radical phases, the Jacobins, who were in control, right, when the revolution was radicalized, they headed in more egalitarian directions with many of their policies and their principles. Pushing them in this direction was a group of working class men known as the sans-culottes, which in French means without breeches. And breeches refers to the type of funky half-tights pants aristocratic men of the period wore, and middle-class men wore as well. So if you could afford them, you would probably wear them, basically. You can see here in this image of a group of sans-culottes, actually, the musicians on the right still sporting the traditional culotte breeches, and the sans-culotte on the left, excuse me if I'm butchering the French, by the way, which is perfectly possible, is wearing without breeches, right? More just pants. What we would kind of probably call our pants today. Okay. So their very name declared a sense of pride in their humble origins. And through direct and often violent action, they pushed Jacobin leaders to embrace policies of economic and social equality. Moreover, an emphasis on equality also exerted its influence through the writings of philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, probably the thinker who most influenced the French radicals. Now, Rousseau was actually dead by the time of the French Revolution. He died in 1778. But his writings on progress, which unlike most Enlightenment thinkers, he staunchly rejected as a disaster for humankind, and civilization, were absorbed particularly by the middle-class revolutionaries. Rousseau was a bit of contrarian, in other words, offering very different viewpoints than most philosophers of his time period. He probably would have enjoyed being a bit of a troll on the internet today. Most relevant to our discussion here, however, he rejected the notion of private property, and he believed in a form of direct democracy through which the community could express what he called the general will. As Rousseau wrote in 1754, which makes this portion here, this passage I'm about to read, makes for an interesting contrast to John Locke's theory of property, which we discussed a few weeks back, so kind of hold that in your mind and maybe go back and compare it, is this following passage where he says, "The first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, 'This is mine,' and found people naive enough to believe him, that man was the true founder of civil society." I'll pause here to remind you that Rousseau is not a fan of civil society. Okay, resume. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody." Now, the remains of Rousseau were moved during the Revolutionary period from where he died in England to the Pantheon in Paris, which is this basically special place that French people go to sort of worship their best and their brightest. Not literally worship, but you get what I mean. So Rousseau was incredibly important to the mindset of the most radical French revolutionaries. So even equality, right, had a very important role in the French Revolution. And so all three elements of the major ideological forces of modernity were present in that moment. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberté, fraternité, égalité. Whatever order you like best. All right. See you next time.